You're listening to On Shifting Ground from the Commonwealth Club, World Affairs, and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. After a historic presidential campaign, former President Donald Trump defeated Vice President Kamala Harris, and he will return to the White House in January. In the post-election analysis, it's clear Kamala Harris failed to successfully separate herself from the policies of President Joe Biden, and Donald Trump capitalized. One issue where President-elect Trump really wanted to hammer home the differences between his plans and those of his Democratic opponent was immigration, driven in no small part by his own relentless messaging on the subject. For a decade, the public was increasingly worried about the number of people turning up at the southern border, the number of people seeking asylum in the U.S., and perhaps more quietly, about the changing face of America. He and his surrogates promised a much tougher entry for people who want to come to the U.S. to live, an end to birthright citizenship, an end to temporary protected status for tens of thousands of people from troubled countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and South America. And most significantly, he promised the expulsion of millions of people living in the country illegally through mass deportation, an enormous undertaking if he were to try. Ted Hesson joins me now. He's a reporter for Reuters based in Washington, D.C. His work focuses on the policy and politics of immigration, asylum, and border security. Prior to joining Reuters in 2019, Ted covered immigration for Politico. Ted Hesson, welcome to On Shifting Ground. During the campaign, there was a lot of scary talk about immigration during the Biden years, about there being 20, even 30 million people or more in the U.S. who aren't supposed to live here legally, about mass deportation, about an open border, criminals and military-age males pouring into the U.S. It's tough to separate fact from fiction. But over the course of this conversation, why don't we try? In the weeks since Election Day, have you begun to see the outlines of the next president's intentions, his plans for immigration?
Yes, we have. And we can look back to what President-elect Trump has said that he plans to do around immigration. He campaigned in this election cycle saying that there needed to be a crackdown at the border, that President Joe Biden wasn't doing enough to stop illegal immigration, or Vice President Kamala Harris, who he faced off against in the election. And he's also vowed mass deportations of immigrants that are in the country illegally, saying that he wants to reach record levels of that. Now, as we know from Trump's first term, immigration is a top priority for him and for his Republican base as well. It also was a top issue for voters in this past election. So I think he's going into this term feeling as if he has a mandate on the issue and that he wants to approach it aggressively. We do know from Trump's first term that it's one thing to say you want to do the things, and it's another thing to actually do them. There may be people who feel the border was not secure in the last 4 years, and maybe they feel that there should be more deportations. I mean, we see that, but how that plays out and the humanitarian cost, the economic cost, may have people having concerns about this initiative as well.
Sealing off the southern border was a big applause line in many of the stump speeches. What does that involve?
What we've seen is during President Joe Biden's presidency, beginning in 2021, there were record numbers of migrants who were caught crossing illegally. It was something that Biden struggled with, both from an operational standpoint, a political standpoint, and a humanitarian standpoint. I mean, there were times when U.S. authorities were overwhelmed at the border. But in recent months, we've seen Biden take a tougher turn and clamp down on asylum at the border and take other steps to deter migrants from coming. And we've actually seen a pretty steep drop-off in the last 6 months or so. So as it looks right now, and things could change before January 20th when President-elect Trump comes into office, but as it looks right now, Trump will be inheriting a relatively stable border where there is a relatively low level of crossings. And just to put it in perspective, significantly less number of migrants have been caught in recent months than during the same time in 20 before Trump handed off the presidency to Biden. So, you could argue, as of today, President Biden's handing President-elect Trump a more secure border than there was 4 years ago when Biden took office. But that being said, Trump has said he wants to declare a national emergency to reroute Pentagon funds to border enforcement and also use those funds for his mass deportation initiative. It remains unclear exactly how much money we're talking about, exactly what he would do with the military resources. But I think what we've heard from people close to the Trump transition and allies of Trump is that the military could be used for transportation in the mass deportation effort and almost to supplement back-end operations while the ICE officers, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers, are out there actually making arrests. But again, the details of it remain to be seen. We more or less know the broad brushstrokes of how they want to approach it.
I want to talk more about mass deportation a little later in the conversation. I want to begin with the border itself. A lot of people talk about the border, and a lot fewer people in the United States actually have been to it, have seen it, have tried to cross it. It is one of the most active international frontiers on the planet. A lot of stuff moves across the border. A lot of people move across that border. Would sealing off the movement of people make moving the stuff back and forth harder to do?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it depends how things move forward on the diplomatic front. We've seen already President-elect Trump is threatening 25% tariffs against both Mexico and Canada unless both countries step up their efforts to stop migration and to stop fentanyl from coming into the U.S., the dangerous illicit fentanyl. But that being said, I think we have already seen quite a few border security measures in recent decades, and the border in many places is much more secure than it's ever been in the history of the U.S. During President Trump's first term, he was not able to build a wall from one end of the border to the other as he was anticipating when he took office. But that said, he did add hundreds of miles of replacement wall that in many cases is very tall and serves as some degree of an impediment from people crossing. There's also been great enhancements in technology. And President-elect Trump is pledging, or he said he wants to hire thousands more Border Patrol officers as well. So, I mean, we could be looking at a situation where there are more deterrents in place for illegal migration. Now, what that means for trade, I'm not quite sure. I mean, the trade is coming through legal border crossings. Some of it will depend on how this tariff fight plays out. And if the U.S. does go forward with 25% tariffs, and, in that case, we may even see retaliatory tariffs from either Mexico or Canada or both.
You mentioned the Trump announcement of new challenges for Canada and Mexico, let's call it. Claudia Sheinbaum, the recently elected president of Mexico, said, look, we're already doing those things. Is she right? Was that a fair comment? A fair reply?
Mexico, since January, has greatly stepped up its immigration enforcement on its side of the border, and it's something we've reported on. They've detained hundreds of thousands of migrants as they've moved north and slowed down their progress to the U.S. and in some cases stopped them altogether. Now, the way their immigration enforcement works is different than ours. Whereas in the U.S., immigration agents might arrest you and put you into a detention center. You may spend months or even years there and then be deported back to your home country. Mexico, under their law, detains people for short periods of time and has focused more on busing them to the south of the country. And, if they find them at the northern border, migrants who are making their way, they're busing them south or to other parts, and to restricting access to transit visas that they had previously given. And just taking steps in general to make it harder to basically tire people out as they move north. And when you talk to U.S. border officials, they do think that's made a big difference. And partly President Biden back in June clamped down on asylum at the border and made it much harder to claim asylum if you cross illegally. But at the same time, Mexico has also greatly stepped up their enforcement. And together, that's why I think in recent months, you've seen this dramatic drop in the number of migrants trying to cross and the number of migrants who've been apprehended by border authorities.
One thing the open borders rhetoric obscured was just how much money and personnel were always directed toward border enforcement when Donald Trump was president, when Joe Biden was president, even when Barack Obama was president. Open borders conjures up an image of a simply undefended frontier, minimal resources, a small force. Isn't the reality a little different?
I think that's right. And President Trump does use that phrase to say the border is open, there are open borders. And I think, we don't need a fact checker here to say that it isn't an open border and there's more security now than there ever has been historically. And every year we see it increasing. We don't see it backing off, partly a result of the political climate in the US and enhancement in technology as well to monitor people crossing and investments in it. That said, from the Republican standpoint, there is a view that the crossings are still way too high. They're also opposed to some of the legal entry programs that have been launched during the Biden administration. And that's another factor that's contributed to the lower number of people crossing illegally. The Biden administration has been opening up pathways that allow would-be migrants to apply for legal entry. In some cases, if they have sponsors in the U.S., they can potentially come in on a flight to the U.S. and get a 2-year work permit and permission to stay in the country. Or if they're in Mexico already, they can go on an app and apply for an appointment to come to a legal port of entry and request asylum and ask for entry. So they've tried to steer more of those illegal crossings into a more regularized, orderly way to come into the U.S. But that said, President-elect Trump opposes those programs and says they're essentially going around the legal immigration system to find ways to let people in who wouldn't normally have a pathway into the U.S.
If I understand the rationale behind it, it was meant to lower attempts to cross illegally, meant to lower attempts to cross in the more dangerous, unguarded portions of the frontier, and channel people toward places where we'd know they're trying to come in. Is that a fair conclusion?
Exactly right. And the places are, if they're already in Mexico and they're applying on the app, they come to a legal border crossing at a scheduled time in a very orderly fashion. They have to be there for their appointment. And then if they're coming through the sponsorship program that I mentioned, they'd be applying from their home country or from another country and entering on an airline where they pay for their own ticket to the U.S. or their sponsor in the U.S. pays for the ticket. And in that case, they're also showing a U.S. sponsorship. So they're showing they have someone here who, at least at a minimal level, will be able to help support them once they arrive. So yes, those programs were aimed at reducing the illegal migration into the country. And they're things that once President-elect Trump takes office, we expect that he'll try and end.
Are there reliable figures about how many people are in the country deportable or unauthorized in some way? Because one of the areas of our national life where there's been a lot of loose talk is in trying to define that number. What number do you work with in your reporting?
That's a great question. In January, or as of January 2022, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security estimates there were 11 million immigrants in the country without legal status. And that's January 2022. So that's 2 years ago. And as I mentioned, there have been very high levels of immigration since then. So there's definitely the potential that when they revisit this number, they'll find that it's higher, that it's more like 13 or 14 million. We don't know for sure. I have seen advocacy groups come up with their own estimates between 13 and 14 million. And I think that would be arguable just based on the number of people we've seen encountered at the border and who've entered through other pathways. And one thing to keep in mind is even when you're talking about that 11 million, some do have a quasi-legal status. Not all of them are in the country with no status at all. That includes people who have what's called temporary protected status, and some million or more people around in that ballpark. I think maybe around 800,000 that currently have it. And also people who are part of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program for young people who were brought to the U.S. as children, people who were brought to the U.S. as children by their parents and now have way to work legally and have deportation relief. So there's several programs out there that offer kind of a temporary deportation reprieve and work permits that are included in that 11 million or 15 million.
I cover this issue a lot. We've talked about it in the past, and I had no idea that DACA and TPS recipients were under that umbrella of the 11 million, that they were actually being counted in that total. Let's talk a little bit more about TPS. It has been extended on a kind of ad hoc, episodic basis to people who come from very troubled countries. Does that ever get revisited when a country kind of returns to normal? Do we invite people to go back home if they sought refuge here during a time when their country was in tumult? Or effectively, has TPS been, no matter how insecure it might feel, a pretty stable way to be in the United States if you are a national of Venezuela, of Haiti, of El Salvador, and other places?
The TPS program, as you mentioned, is available to people whose countries are experiencing extraordinary conditions, right? They were a natural disaster, an armed conflict, something that due to this, the Homeland Security Secretary in the U.S. deems they can't go back to their home country. So when they make these designations, it's for the people who are in the U.S. already. And it's saying because your country is in this state, you don't have to go home at the moment and you can stay. What we've seen in practice is that some of the designations have lasted decades. El Salvador has one, Honduras as well, stemming from natural disasters in those countries that have just been renewed and renewed over years. They typically last for just 6 to 18 months at a time. So these renewals come up frequently, but they typically are renewed. So as you mentioned, they become dependent and people expect to have them there. In some cases, they've worked legally in the U.S. for 20 years with their TPS status. That said, during President-elect Trump's first term in office, he tried to end the vast majority of enrollment in the program on the grounds that these were being rubber stamped, that basically the disasters that led to the initial designation for protected status have been resolved at this point, and they were, years old or decades old, and that the program was being abused. His efforts to do that were stopped in court, and the case was hung up for something like 2 years. I do expect when he comes back to office, that he'll try again to end these statuses as they come up for renewal. And as I mentioned, they last for 6 to 18 months. So that means over a year and a half period after he takes office, we're going to see the dozen and a half countries that have TPS status come up for renewal. And he'll have to make a decision on each one, what he wants to do.
It's a really interesting collision of theory and practice. I mean, a lot of Americans, I think, would be very comfortable with the idea that we allow some sort of refuge here for people who come from places that have basically melted down. But one of the ironies of TPS is that you may have it granted during one emergency in your home country, and now you've been here so long that your country is once again in crisis, but you lived through an intermediate period where the United States government might arguably have said, okay, the crisis is over. We think it's safe to go back to Honduras. We think it's safe to go back to Haiti. And now, yet, it would seem a pretty difficult thing to do for an American official to say, Haiti's fine now. We think it's time for you to go back there.
I think that's a great example. I mean, Haiti is one of the countries that has a TPS designation that initially stemmed from the earthquake there. And in that case, had lasted, I'm just doing the math here, about 12 or 13 years until it was more recently renewed and acknowledged some of the ongoing instability that's happening at the moment. So they more or less updated the status to acknowledge more of what's happening. But that said, President Trump has talked about Haiti and Haitians in the U.S., and I think it's likely he would at least strongly consider ending it. And I know that the rationale in the first term in some of these cases was that even if some parts of a country may be in turmoil, like for instance, Port-au-Prince may be in turmoil, there are other parts of the country that could be safe, and that someone could return there and go to another community in the country and not be in danger. And I know There would be objections to that, and certainly advocacy groups here in the US and Haitian American groups would feel differently, I think. But I could imagine that if they do terminate the Haitian TPS or other TPS designations, the rationale will be that within these countries there are safe zones where people could return to.
The Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that the President of the United States has wide discretion in the area of immigration. If the new president were to try to move ahead on this multi-front assault that he has been talking about, would there be legal challenges in the high court? Should we already be assuming, as happened with TPS, that a maximalist approach from the new Trump administration would wind up in litigation, maybe years of litigation?
During President-elect Trump's first term, he found that many of his hardline immigration initiatives were caught up in court for years at a time. In some cases, he was victorious. I mean, one example was his travel ban that initially targeted Muslim majority nations and then was expanded to other nations as well. But ultimately, that authority was upheld in court and was used throughout the Trump administration, and we expect will be used again when he comes back to office. And there were other examples where the court stopped him. I mean, during his first term, he attempted to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. The DACA program that I mentioned was available to people who are brought to the U.S. as children and currently has about 500,000 people enrolled. But in that case, the Supreme Court stopped his termination of the program and said that it wasn't done properly. Now, the makeup of the court has changed since Trump's first term. It's more conservative. And even as we looked at how advocacy organizations handled President Biden's immigration policies, and there were times when Biden was rolling out things that were restrictive, that advocates didn't support, and they sued over it, they were more cautious about bringing a case quickly up to the Supreme Court. And I think that's knowing that they just don't have a favorable court there. The justices are not going to be, they don't have the sort of balance of power that they might like. So I do wonder what the outlook will be like. I think the Trump administration may be more likely to press ahead fast and to try and get cases up to the Supreme Court fast and find out, test it, see how they feel about some of the issues that came around the first time. Maybe with the current makeup, they're favorable to it. Maybe try and reopen some immigration fights that are decades or more than 100 years old and say, hey, can we test precedent around these things and what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do?
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, will the Trump administration challenge birthright citizenship? Just how far Trump might go. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. One standout area where testing precedent would be required by definition is to revisit jus soli, that's the Latin term, the law of the soil, that has granted any person born on American soil American citizenship. Stephen Miller and other people who are influential in the Trump orbit have promised that they want to strip birthright citizenship from people born in the United States. Doesn't that require going to war against Wong Kim Ark versus the U.S., an 1890s decision of the Supreme Court?
Yes, and I think that's a fight that they're going to want to try. I mean, and we heard from President-elect Trump during his campaign that he said he would issue an executive order to roll back birthright citizenship after taking office. And it's something he flirted with during his first term. He ultimately never did. I think it's an idea that has gained more support in Republican circles in recent years, but is still a radical change and would just be a sharp departure from how the U.S. has handled immigration. And just to be clear, when we say birthright citizenship, we're saying that very simply, when someone's born on U.S. soil, that they become a U.S. citizen. And the idea would be to try and restrict that, to issue an executive order that says that in cases where the parent, either one parent or both parents, don't have legal status, that person is not entitled to citizenship. And we know, as you mentioned, from long lasting Supreme Court precedent that that's been upheld and that the view has been that it's a constitutional protection. But would they be willing to take this case back again and see if the court will revisit it? I'm sure they would. And in their view, they could make an attempt at it. And if they're successful, then they get what they want. And if they're not, then they show their supporters that they took a chance to try and change it.
There are things that are almost breathtaking being speculated about in that world. And sometimes you have to sift through and see how close to the president some of these people are. But there's been speculation about stripping citizenship from people who already have it, denaturalization, along with things like revoking birthright citizenship. It'll be interesting to see where he comes down on a lot of these things. You're even closer to this than I am, for sure. Is there more of an appetite among the Republicans who control the House and Senate to take a look at these things?
I think what we have heard, and Trump advisor Stephen Miller, who's really the architect of his first term immigration agenda and chief policy advisor when it comes to immigration matters, has said they want to step up that denaturalization effort in the second term. I believe he said supercharge or something along those lines. But that said, they also did have what they called a denaturalization task force during Trump's first term, and it didn't tackle too many cases. I don't have the numbers on hand, but I know it wasn't a sweeping effort by any means. It was an increase over the number of people who had been denaturalized previously, but not by a hugely significant sum. And there are legitimate cases where people have lied on their citizenship applications. They may have some sort of serious criminal history or terror relation or something that's very significant, right, from a national security standpoint that needs to be addressed. So not these aren't necessarily baseless cases. And I think that it remains to be seen how extensive something like that might be. As for the appetite, my view, and what we will find out, is that typically it's easier to be unified when you're the minority party in Congress, and you can really criticize the party that's in power and have that view. When the power tips to your side, things can become more divisive within your own party. And I think we're going to see to what extent that happens. You may see moderates who start feeling uncomfortable with certain things. I mean, one thing that we've looked at is just the labor issue. When you start talking about mass deportations, there are some industries in this country that very evidently rely on immigrants who are in the country illegally. And agriculture is a clear one. It's no secret. And if a future Trump administration wanted to mass deport people, they could very quickly find them at many of the farms and meatpacking plants and places around the country that are supplying the food here. And that's been, a point of contention already, where you've had some Republican voices speaking out and industry voices saying, we need some guarantees that for people who are law abiding, for people that have been here for years, who have a job, that they're not going to be a priority as part of this.
The stats that came out recently tried to identify the industries where people who are in the country illegally, who are in the workforce, what they're up to, what they're doing. The three top industries were construction, agriculture, and hospitality. And they run on immigrant labor. If you've stayed in a hotel in the recent past, if you've seen the work that's not only done on farms, but in food processing, if you've been at a work site or watched a subdivision rise outside Las Vegas, outside the development perimeter in the Atlanta metro, millions of workers are building new homes, even in a country where home shortages and home prices are a tremendously politically sensitive matter. We're already seeing the battle lines drawing. Is that what you're saying?
Right. And I think the labor force issue is just a real point of tension here that we're going to see come out. I mean, when you talk about mass deportation, of course, there's a humanitarian aspect. Inevitably, this will lead to families being separated, and that happens already when it comes to people being deported. And I think as you increase the scale, you'll find more families that are touched by this, and not just families that are in the U.S. illegally, many are people who are living in a household that have a U.S. citizen or a green card holder there. So you're talking about effects that will ripple out to millions of people potentially, or even tens of millions, depending on what the scope is. But also, that's the humanitarian side. And I think the economic side is very clear. I mean, you have these industries that are largely dependent on immigrants who don't have legal status here, who would, in many cases, the industries would like to see a pathway to a legal work permit for these workers. They would like a way for them to adjust their status here, and it just doesn't exist. So I do think that will be a point of tension going forward.
When I first started covering immigration, this was largely an issue that was most talked about and most speculated about in coastal and southwestern congressional districts. But now there are large numbers of immigrants and large numbers of unauthorized immigrants in all kinds of places in the United States. This is no longer a southwestern and coastal phenomenon anymore, and the Republican Party now has a lot of seats in places where there are communities that have been transformed, and many times for the better, by immigration, fading towns that have been rebuilt and revived, industries that were hungry for labor that are now blazing and firing on all cylinders. Is the politics of this a lot more complicated than just people cheered when Donald Trump threw some of the tougher proposals out there, and now he has to make good on them?
I think that's right. And I think what we saw during the campaign is that even the idea of mass deportation polled fairly well for Trump. I mean, we routinely saw about half of Americans were supportive of the idea of deporting people in the country illegally. But at the same time, there was also opposition to the idea of using detention camps as part of the effort. So I think what we may find going forward, if this initiative is at the scale that they're promising, and if it's historic, is that some of the reality of it will be a test of what Americans' appetite is for it. Because I think the idea of deporting someone in theory, in an abstract way, they may be supportive of, but they may be less supportive of the idea of, say, going to a child's school and arresting parents as they're taking their kids to school, going outside of a church as people are going to church on Sunday, going to a hospital, and whereas people are coming for medical treatment, and the separation of families generally. The idea of parents, U.S.-born kids who are here, and their parents are deported back to their home countries. I mean, like I mentioned, that happens already, to some degree, and the more it's accelerated and the more targeting there is of people who haven't committed crimes and people who are just here working legally, or also longer term residents, I think the more you'll see that increase. And again, it's one thing to talk about in the abstract, another thing, the reality. And I'm thinking back to 2018 when Donald Trump was president during his first term, and he launched his policy to separate families at the US-Mexico border. And I think when you look back, when on paper, that appeared to the Trump's immigration officials like a strong deterrent, that this was going to send a signal, don't come. But it created a very sharp public backlash in the US, internationally, and even Trump, with his hardline attitude towards the issue, reversed his policy within about a month of doing that and found that it was just too divisive, and I think was not willing to go forward with it. I think we just see that as evidence. So I think we'll see as they test the limits of this, what the public reaction is and how they respond to it as well.
If a president really intends to remove all those people, what would have to happen in terms of building up a workforce, people to put places, as you mentioned, while they're awaiting removal, hearing judges, transportation links? This sounds tremendously expensive, and it doesn't sound like something that the president can do on his own, that he has to have congressional buy-in for something that he's going to call mass deportation.
Again, I think we don't know the scale of exactly what they'll do yet. Trump has said he wants record numbers of deportations. He struggled with that particular issue during his first term. We actually saw a drop in deportations from Obama's term into Trump. And if you're looking at even Biden's numbers, if you look at the number of people that were both removed from the country by ICE on deportation flights and those who were returned back to Mexico by CBP. We saw Biden had even more people removed by that definition last year than during any Trump year. So there is a question of how exactly they do tally these numbers and what the scale of it is. They've already said, though, that they do want to seek more resources, that President-elect Trump would declare it illegal immigration a national emergency and use that to unlock Pentagon funds and maybe other funds and different resources across the federal government. And they want this whole of government approach. I mean, they do have the federal government in front of them. And while they might not have access to every plane and every personnel or law enforcement officer, they can pull resources and they can shift them. They've done that historically under every administration. And I think they will do that to a degree. And so there is this question of, yes, it will be expensive. And even they're saying that you can expect it to be expensive, whatever they end up doing. But that said, we don't know exactly what the costs will be. And it may depend on whether some of these people are people who've just arrived and are being quickly removed, say sent back to Mexico. That's going on a lot now. And that's a low cost way to remove someone from the country. And one thing to remember when we talk about that 11 million people who in 2022 was the estimate for people here illegally, a little less than half were from Mexico. So we're not necessarily talking about a deportation flight to the other side of the world to remove someone. It could be as simple as walking them across the border in some cases. That said, I think we do expect there to be costs, and it just remains unclear how efficient they'll be in shifting resources around and quickly removing people from the country. I can tell you that's their objective, to do things quickly and to do them really as affordably as possible. But ultimately, just for one example, we've seen estimates that this could cost tens of billions of dollars, to hundreds of billions of dollars over 10 years. So, there's some groups are saying that this could be extremely costly. And I think if you're thinking of a scale of removing every person who's here illegally, yes, it would be. But if you're thinking of a scale of doing more than what Trump did in his first term, maybe that's more within the confines of, the resources they have at their disposal now.
That's Ted Hesson. He covers immigration for Reuters. He's based here in Washington, D.C. You've seen his reporting in Vice, The Atlantic, Politico. Ted, great to have you with us on Shifting Ground.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, an excerpt of my conversation with Shereen Marisol Meraji about my new book, We Are Home. You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Earlier this year, I published my latest book, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century. In my reporting, I crisscrossed the country to speak to new Americans from all corners of the globe, and I captured their stories. Back in July, in front of a live audience, I spoke with Shereen Marisol Meraji. She's a producer and journalist, former host of NPR's Code Switch, and assistant professor at UC Berkeley's School of Journalism. I shared stories of what I learned on the road, and Shereen and I talked about what these portraits of a new America tell us about who we are and who we're becoming.
You said you wrote this book in reaction to the Great Replacement theory. I would love for you to talk a little bit about why that inspired you to write We Are Home.
I read the Great Replacement Manifesto, which floats around in some of the darker corners of the internet. And it seemed to me to be one of the most un-American, ugly set of ideas that could be written by an American. Mm-hmm. And the Great Replacement theory works on the premise that secretly forces in society, Jews, are gaming immigration law, gaming legislative rules, and flooding the country purposely with non-white immigrants in order to replace the white population of the United States. Underlying this, or the foundation of it, is the belief that all good things that we have as a country have been made, developed, invented, thought of, advanced by white people. And that if white Americans are replaced as a percentage of the population, that's the beginning of the end of America.
Ray, I feel like this is absurd, absolute anti-Semitic bullshit.
Yeah, you could
So
call that.
why not ignore it?
Too many
Why
people
respond to
believe it.
it?
Yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's noxious. Yes, it's ugly. But if enough people believe it, you kind of have to pay attention to the fact that it's there. And the shooters in Poway, California, and in Pittsburgh, and in Buffalo, and in El Paso, men who went to kill lots of people in those places, when you look at their own personal writing and emails and internet traffic, it's fired up by the Great Replacement theory. So it's not a benign thing to have frustrated, disappointed people read this thing and say, I'm being cheated out of my birthright, which is to be in charge of this country, which is to be important, which is to know that if we make a line for some goodies that are being given out by society, I'm going to be at the front of the line. It's not just some wacky thing that some crazy right-wing person that they saw on TV is talking about. I mean, are you worried about this?
I am worried about
So it's not just me.
No. No, but sometimes I wonder if things that are so absurd and ridiculous, are we adding more oxygen by talking about them?
It's always a worry. Am I giving this thing more attention than it would get on its own? I came away from that deliberation sure that more people should know about this thing and know what's in it. They may have just heard the phrase, but never really thought too much about what was in it. They may have heard some YouTuber that they like talking about it, but never really read any of it. Don't be Great Replacement adjacent. Know what it is so you know what's going on.
You know, another thing you said is that you wrote this book in reaction to the national discourse on immigration, which was ahistorical. You know, people really didn't know the historical context and they didn't understand immigration policy. And I will say that as a journalist who has written stories about immigrants who have been affected by immigration policy, deeply affected, I think there definitely has been pushback from editors and gatekeepers who are not as interested in getting into the policy weeds. It's complicated, one. It's hard to make it interesting, and you have a very short amount of time. So it's like, let's center the human story and kind of ignore the policy bit or limit how much we talk about the policy bit. And personally, as a journalist, I think we're really doing our audience a disservice by leaving that out of the conversation. And then we get these national conversations around immigration that are ahistorical, that do go off the rails.
When I talk to people about the Hart-Celler Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, I get a blank stare. They have no idea what it is. It's one of the most significant pieces of legislation of the entire Johnson administration, an administration which had tons of significant legislation. It gave us the America that we have now and the one that's coming in the 2040s. And its legislative champion in the U.S. Senate, Teddy Kennedy, and its champion in the White House, Lyndon Johnson, one of the ways they got recalcitrant Southern senators to vote for it was by telling them that it wasn't really going to change the country. They were wrong.
And talk about what that act did that changed the immigration system.
From 1924 to 1965, we had a set of laws in place that created formulas and quotas that favored Europe. So if you wanted to come to this country from Europe, you were in pretty good shape. If you wanted to come from anywhere else, it was significantly harder. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act pretty much throws open the door to the rest of the world. And, you know, there were small numbers of Indians, Pakistanis, Southeast Asians. They were here, but in very small numbers. Now we're talking about numbers in the millions, and Asian immigrants to the United States are the fastest growing category of people moving here from elsewhere on the planet.
There's something in this book that really made me feel something, and I want to read it. And this is about this feeling of being welcome here or not being welcome here. And there's a woman in the book named Dalia Mogahed, and she came to the United States from Egypt. She wears hijab, and you asked her if she felt less welcome in the United States of America post 9/11. And her response to you was really interesting. She says to you, Ray, you use the word welcome, and I like that you used it because it gives me a chance to say, I'm not waiting for a welcome. This is my home. If anyone has a problem with me being in my home, they are free to leave. But I'm not waiting for anyone's welcome because I'm not a guest here. Then she goes on to say, I push back on Muslims who talk about not feeling welcomed because it will create a paradigm in your mind where you are forever the guest to a host, and it's in an unhealthy way to think.
Yes, and Dahlia is tough and smart and needle sharp. And I was shifting in my seat a little bit. I mean, I thought it was a perfectly reasonable question. And I felt the desire to be welcomed from these people who told me their stories.
Yeah.
They wanted to just be regarded as neighbors and workmates and friends and all that. And Dahlia, that was a very smart idea because she sees a power dynamic set up by the use of that word welcome, where someone else can put themselves in a position of being able to give you permission to be somewhere where you already belong.
I loved it.
That was a very good point. I still think immigrants want to feel welcome.
It's true.
But she's right that we don't have anybody who's a gatekeeper for you. There's a phrase that's being used now, heritage Americans or legacy Americans. That's the phrase Tucker Carlson uses.
Are we talking about Native Americans?
No, funnily enough, we're not. He means people who have been here long enough that they're really supposed to run the show. And the very strong sense that they are gatekeepers, that they get to say who belongs and who doesn't, that they get to say who is American enough and who's not, helps fuel that great replacement rhetoric, helps fuel that idea that someone else can decide for you whether you've done enough to be considered by them to be an American. The brass on those people is unbelievable, but they're actually being encouraged by people like Tucker Carlson. Once and for all, there is no such thing as a legacy American. If you're an American, you're American, and no one else can say you're not, or you're not like them, or you're not as American as they are. And thank God for that.
Ray, can you talk about why you embraced personal stories in your book? How was it a different experience for you?
This is my fourth book, and the previous three books were pretty conventionally told books by a journalist. Dive into archives, city records, and interviews too. But for this book, the longer I worked on it, the more I became convinced that instead of just being part of the story I tell, these personal stories have to become the core of the book. Partially because they told their lives better than I could talking about them. It gave them the privilege of self-definition instead of retaining for me the privilege of definition, which a journalist always has or often has. But here they spoke for themselves and told their stories in ways that were surprising, shocking, amusing, all kinds of things. But they did it for themselves. And I'm glad my editor and I fought over this a long time, and we ended up with that. He was right. I was wrong.
Wait, so talk about the battle. What did you want to do with the book, and what was your editor? Your editor was pushing it to be more personal.
My first couple of chapters were pretty angry. It was an angry book.
Okay.
And he said, "Oh, don't write this angry book. I think there's another story here to tell. Tell that other stuff. Yeah, and it's in there. But it's not just that."
Got it.
So,
and he was right, you're
and he was
saying.
right. I think he was right, yeah. If Trump is reelected, just how dark will the next chapter of American immigration get? Well, depends on if he really means what he says. But I think there are a lot of people who, in principle, when they hear of mass deportation, they think, yeah, well, those people are breaking the law, they shouldn't be here, blah, blah, blah. But when they turn on the TV and see vans with people being dragged into them by uniformed agents of the state with their kids standing out on the sidewalk and screaming and crying, then it won't be abstract anymore. It won't be an abstract principle. What mass deportation would look like in a country that really means to do it is something that Americans could never countenance. I really believe that. So he says he's going to do it. I don't know if he's really going to do it, but if he tried to do it, I think it would horrify even many of the people who think that today, in principle, they're for it. Because what it would do, leaving empty houses on streets in cities all over the country, stores that don't open up tomorrow morning because their owner is in detention somewhere, shifts that aren't full because workers are gone now. We're not ready for that, and we're kidding ourselves if we think we are. You can get your hands on a copy of my new book, We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, at your local bookstore now. You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. Our host is me, Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.